What if I told you that the worst war crime of the 20th century didn't involve a bomb, a gun, or a soldier? What if I told you it involved a 3-day-old baby? And what if I told you that the people who did it, the people who turned human beings into lab rats, didn't get punished? They got a deal. Most of us think we know the horrors of World War II. We know the battles, the politics, the camps, but there is one chapter that often gets left out of the history books. Maybe because it's too dark. Maybe because the details are so twisted. They make horror movies look like bedtime stories. I'm talking about a place where military doctors dissected people alive. A place where they froze newborns to death just to check a stopwatch. A place where they dropped literal plague bombs on innocent villages to see what would happen. This is the story of Unit 731, and fair warning, once you hear this, you won't be able to unhear it. Let's go. Biological warfare. To understand this place, you have to understand its purpose. Unit 731 wasn't just a hospital gone wrong. It was a mass death machine built for one specific reason: to test biological weapons in the field. The scientists there didn't want to simulate outbreaks. They wanted the real thing. So they turned their attention to the skies over Chinese villages. Picture this. It's the middle of the war. Food is scarce. You're a villager, and suddenly, you see a plane flying low overhead. But it's not dropping explosives, it's dropping bags. Bags of rice, bags of corn. You think, hey, free food. You think it's a miracle, but it was a trap. Those bags weren't just food, they were infested with plague-carrying fleas. The doctors at Unit 731 had turned nature's smallest pests into weapons of mass destruction. Within days, the villagers started getting sick. The bubonic plague swept through the population, and when that wasn't enough, they escalated. They introduced cholera, then typhoid, then dysentery. They didn't stop at the air. They poisoned the wells the villagers drank from. They laced the local marshes with disease. They did all of this just to see how effectively they could wipe out a population. Tens of thousands of innocent civilians were infected. Entire communities were decimated. And when the reports went back to headquarters, the commanders didn't call it a tragedy. They called it terrifyingly successful. The surgery block. But if the field tests were cold and distant, the work inside the facility was personal. This is where the story gets difficult. Inside the walls of Unit 731, the researchers conducted what they called practice surgery. They would infect prisoners with deadly diseases like anthrax to study the progression. But they didn't wait for the autopsy. They would strap the prisoners to a table and cut them open while they were still alive, with no anesthesia. You might ask, why? The doctors claimed that anesthesia might affect the data. They thought it might change how the organs reacted or alter the blood flow. So, for the sake of pure data, they removed organs one by one while the victim was awake, screaming, and watching. They treated the human body like it was made of spare parts. They would saw off a limb and reattach it to the other side of the body, just to test surgical outcomes. They wanted to see if the body would accept a left arm on the right socket. It didn't. And they had no limits. They didn't even spare pregnant women. There is a report of one victim who begged the doctors to at least save her unborn child. She thought that surely even in a place like this there was a line. But there wasn't. She didn't make it. Neither did the baby. The extreme cold. While some doctors were obsessed with heat and disease, others were obsessed with the cold. Winters in the region were brutal, and the military needed to know how to treat frostbite. So, they turned the prison yard into a frozen hell. They dragged prisoners outside, stripped them down, and made them stand in sub-zero temperatures. They would take the prisoners' limbs and dunk them into buckets of ice water. They held them there, ignoring the shivering and the pleading, until the flesh froze solid. And how did they know it was frozen enough? A guard would walk up with a stick and strike the arm. If it made a sound, if it cracked like a piece of dried wood, then they knew it was ready. Once the limbs were shattered, the science began. They moved the victims inside for thaw tests. They tried everything. They rubbed the raw, frozen flesh. They held it over open fire. They poured scalding hot water on it. They weren't trying to heal them. They were just seeing which method caused the most damage. Other prisoners were put under high-intensity heat lamps. They were left there until they dehydrated so completely that they literally mummified while still alive. And through all of this, through every cracked limb and every burn, they documented every single scream. It was data to them, just numbers on a page. Pressure and chemistry. If you're still watching, take a breath, because we aren't done. We have to talk about the chemical testing. The facility had special glass rooms. From the outside, they looked almost like observation decks. Inside, they were death chambers. Prisoners were blindfolded, tied to poles, and locked inside. Then, the doctors would turn a valve. They pumped in poison gas. The doctors stood outside with their clipboards, watching through the glass. They watched as the victims convulsed. They watched as they suffered internal failure. They timed exactly how long it took for the lungs to fail. In one particularly twisted experiment, they harvested the fluid from the blisters of a gas victim. Then, they injected that fluid into another prisoner, just to see what would happen. There was no antidote, just pain and observation. They also treated human bodies like crash test dummies. They tied prisoners to stakes and threw live grenades at them. They tested flamethrowers to see how skin burns. But the most bizarre test, the one that sounds like straight science fiction, was the pressure chamber. They sealed victims in high-pressure vacuum chambers and slowly cranked the air pressure up. They wanted to find the breaking point of the human form. They kept increasing the pressure until the victims' eyes were forced from their sockets. They spun people in centrifuges until they lost consciousness. They crushed them under heavy logs. They electrocuted them. It wasn't warfare. It was a playground for monsters. And the toys were human bodies. The ultimate violation. Now we have to touch on the darkest corner of this hell. The cruelty wasn't just physical, it was violating. The researchers were obsessed with how diseases spread, but they didn't study it in a lab. They infected prisoners and then forced them to interact. They weaponized the most intimate act of human life. Women were forcibly impregnated. They were kept alive just long enough to be observed, and when they finally gave birth, the babies were taken away. They were used for experiments. Not a single baby born in that facility survived. The dehumanization was total. The doctors even gave these infected pregnant women a nickname. They called them objects with filling. Let that sink in. To them, a pregnant woman carrying a child was nothing more than a pastry. If there's a hell, these guys have a VIP section reserved just for them. The baby. And this brings us back to the question I asked you at the very beginning. The atrocity that stands out even among all this madness. They took a newborn baby, 3 days old, a life that had barely begun, a child that had never seen the world outside the walls of a death camp. They put this baby outside in the biting winter cold. There was no blanket to keep it warm. There was no mother to hold it, just the wind and a doctor with a stopwatch. The experiment was titled Infant Resilience to Cold. They didn't intervene. They didn't help. They just watched, and they took notes on exactly how long it took for the life to fade from that tiny body. It wasn't science. It was a cold-blooded execution with a clipboard. The immunity deal. Unit 731 killed thousands of people inside the lab. They killed hundreds of thousands more with the germ warfare attacks. When the war ended in 1945, the facility was burned. The evidence was destroyed. But the scientists? They were captured by the United States. Now, you'd think this is the part where the gavel drops. You'd think they were put on trial and convicted like the war criminals in Nuremberg. But that's not what happened. They were granted immunity. Why? Because the US wanted the data. The American government looked at the frostbite charts, the syphilis studies, the pressure tests, and they decided it was too valuable to lose. They made a deal with the devil. In exchange for the research, the monsters walked free. Shiro Ishii, the man who masterminded this entire nightmare, died of natural causes. He died in his own bed, a free man. To this day, there has been no full official apology that matches the scale of what was done. We live in a world where some crimes are punished and others are just filed away. Share this video, because sometimes real history is terrifyingly worse than fiction. See ya.